So much for being here today. I am so pleased to be able to offer this class during King's College. I'm Signora Lucina Romano, but for those of you who don't know, in mundane life, I'm Dr. Devon Stewart. I have a PhD in art history and a specialization in Roman art, and I was actually very fortunate enough to excavate at Pompeii when I was in grad school. So I did 4 seasons with the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project, Porta Stabia, and for someone who for most of their life was an inside human, I can't tell you what a wonderful experience that really was. So although Pompeii is not typically a part of my research, Pompeii is a subject that's very, very near and dear to my heart. It's a great point of entry for those of us who are interested in learning more about the ancient Roman world and about archaeology. And it's something we're all probably generally familiar with. But I wanted to offer this class to give us a little more familiarity and to sort of break down the, I guess, what we know and why we know it. Because as familiar as Pompeii is to us, it is first and foremost only one of a number of cities on the Bay of Naples to be affected by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. And moreover, it is such an important sort of snapshot of life. And that's kind of the enduring importance of Pompeii in learning about Roman archaeology, is that, well, and the entirety of the region, right? We do have this kind of snapshot of daily life. And those of you, I mean, I assume if you're attending this class, you keep up with these things. So you may have also recently seen some of the wonderful new discoveries that have been found during the course of the Great Pompeii Project, which began as a project meant to preserve the existing architecture, excavation region cleared down to eruption level. And part of the reason why they had to do that was because to stabilize what's already uncovered, they kind of had to uncover some other things and go in. And that has produced some really fabulous new archaeology, which we'll also be talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We will have a PowerPoint today. I encourage everyone to if you have a question, please go because I don't necessarily see chat notifications, or at least I haven't in the past. I will try to be brief enough that we also have time for a few questions at the end. And I will extend the invitation now. Anyone who is interested in further reading, anyone who has perhaps more lengthy questions, please feel free to contact me via Facebook. I'm Devon Stewart on Facebook, and I'm friends with a number of folks in this room right now. So you can always find me that way. All right, so let us begin. And yes, you are in fact getting college quality lecture material today, for what that's worth. This is a course that, or this is a lecture that I like to give my students when we're about 3/4 of the way through the semester and no one wants to be there anymore, including me. So Pompeii is located on the Bay of Naples, sort of in the middle of the southern half of Italy. So here we're looking at a map of the Italian peninsula. We can see Rome is kind of dead center on the western coast, just a little bit inland from the Tyrrhenian Sea and on the Tiber River. Pompeii is, what, I think maybe 100 miles south. It's a 2-hour train ride to the south. And Pompeii is on the southern side of the Bay of Naples. So the Bay of Naples is this sort of semicircular indentation in the coastline. And the reason why that is a semicircular indentation is because of a very, very, very old, very large volcano that in prehistory blew a giant chunk out of the western coast of Italy. And indeed, this whole region has seismic activity and volcanic activity. And so it should perhaps be no surprise that poor Vesuvius was going to blow its top at one point or the other. So this whole region is known as Campania, and we've all probably heard of the city of Naples. It's also located here, sort of more on the north side of the Bay of Naples. This whole region has been populated since at least the Bronze Age, if not before. And this is sort of the fundamental contradiction of human relationships with volcanoes. Insofar as obviously volcanoes are very, very dangerous geological features that are enormously destructive and a huge threat to human life, especially in antiquity, but their regular eruptions deposit very nutrient-rich materials into the land around them, so that regions around volcanoes tend to be quite fertile and good for agriculture. And because the very long geological time span of a volcano's eruption history, human populations, again, especially in antiquity, they forget. They lose the sort of knowledge that this is an active volcano. And they settle around it because of the good land, and then eventually destruction reigns. And this is exactly what happened at Pompeii and the Bay of Naples. This area is enormously rich for agriculture even today. In antiquity, as we'll see in one of our slides, Vesuvius itself was well known for the many grape arbors that were there. Grapes were grown on the slopes of Vesuvius, and this area was also known, perhaps less so, for olive oil and for garum, the production of the ubiquitous Roman condiment, the garum fish sauce, which they actually put in everything, including desserts. But Pompeii and garum has actually been discovered in Spain, I believe also in North Africa. So this is a big region for agriculture. Pompeii itself was founded in the 6th century BCE, or it took its form in the 6th century BCE, when the course of the city walls were first laid out. Now, the walls that we see today are later rebuilding, but these later walls were built directly on top of the foundations of the archaic wall. The big difference, of course, would have been that in the archaic period, much of the city would have been undeveloped. So we would expect small areas of concentrated habitation, much of which seems to have been located here in the southeastern part of the city, and then lots and lots of open farmland within the city's walls. By the early 3rd century BCE, Pompeii would have begun to grow significantly under the mutual influence of the Greeks who inhabited southern Italy. There were, in fact, so many Greek colonies in southern Italy that region was known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. In the archaic period, and through kind of the 4th century, the Etruscans, who inhabited sort of north central Italy, also had a significant presence in Campania. And I know the dig that I worked on actually found caches of Etruscan votive offerings in our site. So certainly they were present. And there were also local Samnite people who migrated into Campania from the mountains in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Now, also by the 3rd century BCE, Rome had started to grow from what began as a fairly small, but certainly more cosmopolitan city than once thought, now to a growing imperial power. By the 3rd century BCE, they dominated much of the Italian peninsula. And by the 1st century BCE, they would conquer the entirety of the Italian peninsula. And it is in 89 BCE that Pompeii is conquered by the Romans during the Social War, a war between Rome's Italian ally cities and Rome itself. And Pompeii would be refounded as a Roman colony. So beginning around 80 BCE, we see a huge amount of growth in the city. And it's at this point that Pompeii takes on some of its distinctively Roman architectural features, like the Forum right here. Now, this had been a marketplace probably as early as the Archaic period, but it formally becomes a forum. They build a temple to the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno. A new temple to Venus is built just inside the Marine Gate, the gate closest to the harbor. And Pompeii also gets its amphitheater located up here in the corner. And in fact, Pompeii's amphitheater is the oldest surviving permanent stone amphitheater in the entirety of the Roman world. Predates the Colosseum, for example, by a century. So this is when Pompeii becomes a Roman city, and it remains a Roman city for a little more than a century before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Now, under Roman control, Pompeii becomes an important regional center. In antiquity, it was located right on the coast and also right at the mouth of the Sarno River. And so it was an important regional trade center, especially insofar as it brought or it controlled the trade going inland towards the more center of the peninsula. We don't know the exact population of Pompeii at the time of the eruption. Scholars kind of generally agree that it was probably between 15 and 20,000 people living in the city. But of course, that doesn't count the many folks who would have lived on farms in the hinterland outside of the city, nor the population of the other cities like Herculaneum and Stabii to the south that were also destroyed in the eruption. So as far as sort of counting the human toll of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, we simply cannot. There's really no good way to estimate that. So by 79 CE, Pompeii is a thriving Roman city. We know that some members of the imperial family had close connections here. The wife of Nero, Poppaea, her family was known to have a villa quite close to Pompeii. The number of sort of temples to deified emperors here suggests that Pompeii would not have been unfamiliar to the emperors of Rome. The Bay of Naples was very much the kind of vacation spot for wealthy Romans. Many of them had large villas, typically outside of the cities. And so the Bay of Naples was a very well-connected sort of area. And that's part of the reason, probably, why the emperor was actually concerned when Vesuvius erupted. So We've all heard about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, but how do we know what we know about it? Well, there are two primary sources of evidence about the eruption. The first being physical evidence. So the actual stratigraphy of the land, showing us layers and layers of the volcanic debris that was deposited during the eruption. So here we're looking at the edge of the archaeological park, and here you can see this sort of stone here between the piers. This is all lapilli. This is pumice stone, which fell by the meter on Pompeii during the course of the eruption, and then relatively small amounts of volcanic material on top of that, and then, of course, the modern ground level here. So by analyzing the stratigraphy of the land, geologists are able to determine the many sequences of the eruption cycle. But we even have an eyewitness account, and this is the oldest surviving firsthand account of a volcanic eruption that comes down to us. And this was written by Pliny the Younger, who was at Misenum, and we'll just quickly flip back. So Misenum is kind of right here at the northern tip here of the Bay of Naples. And Misenum was I guess, base of the Roman navy. So Pliny the Elder was, or Pliny the Younger was there with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who was the commander of the Roman navy at Misenum. At the time, Pliny the Younger was only 17 years old. And so he is spending time with his uncle, who was also kind of his tutor, alongside his mother. Now, Pliny ends up telling his story at least 28 years later. So he is corresponding with the Roman historian Tacitus. And Tacitus is writing a history of Pliny's family and kind of offhandedly asks about the eruption. And Pliny the Younger says, well, do you really want to hear about that? Is that really appropriate for this, history? And Tacitus says, yeah, that's very interesting. It's of great interest. So please tell your story. And so that is the context in which Pliny, again, decades after the eruption itself, gives his account. So the first of Pliny's letters focuses on the description of the eruption. So it sort of sets the scene. So there in Misenum one day in the early afternoon, they notice that there is a large cloud growing out of a mountain further south in the bay. And at the time, they did not know it was Mount Vesuvius, but this is a very, very curious occurrence. And so Pliny the Elder, being very, very interested in history and the natural world. Indeed, he is the author of the Natural History, a kind of Roman encyclopedia. So Pliny the Elder is like, that's weird. I would like to go and look at that. And so he calls for a ship to be made ready so he can go and take a closer look at this weird cloud. Pliny the Younger notes, he describes this cloud as growing out of Mount Vesuvius and taking a form similar to a pine tree. And if we compare what the eruption cloud of this particular kind of explosive volcano looks like, that's actually a really apt comparison. The Italian stone pine, often called the umbrella pine, is pretty ubiquitous throughout central Italy. And indeed, it does bear a kind of uncanny resemblance to the eruption column that will arise from this kind of explosive eruption. He also talks about, or he speculates as to why the top of the cloud is sort of spreading out like that. And he speculates that it is because the the force of the blast sort of drove the eruption column up into the atmosphere, and then from its weight and as the sort of force of the eruption lessens, it starts to spread out. And indeed, that's actually a really good interpretation. He's not too far off. And because of his very accurate observations, this style of volcanic eruption is now called a Plinian style eruption, which is kind of cool. But my favorite part of this first letter is the end of it, when Pliny tells Tacitus that his uncle invites him to come along on this little field trip to go and look at the volcano that they didn't know was a volcano. And Pliny the Younger says, you know what? No, thank you, uncle. I have to attend to my studies. You've given me a lot of writing to do today, so I'm just going to stay here and do that. And I love it. And I always tell my students, students, if your friends ever invite you out to do something very ill-advised, by all means, tell them that you have to stay home and do your homework, because it may well save your life. And in the case of Pliny the Younger, his decision to stay at Misenum absolutely saved his life. So the second half of the story is recorded in a second letter. And in this letter, we find out that as Pliny the Elder is getting ready to go, he receives an urgent message from his friend, a woman named Rectina, who had a villa somewhere close to the base of Vesuvius, so probably not far from Herculaneum, right here sort of in the center of the bay. And some of our ancient sources describe the entirety of the Bay of Naples as looking like one big long city from the sea for the number of seaside villas built along the coast. So although much of this land is agricultural, there are still a lot of folks here. There is quite a bit of inhabitation here. So Rectina, being located so close to Vesuvius, would have experienced the full power of the first explosion on that day, and she was quite rightly panicked. So she wrote to Pliny requesting that he bring a fleet of ships south to rescue those trapped by the eruption. And so Pliny takes this seriously. He makes ready the fleet. They sail south, but unfortunately, by the time they arrive in the region around Vesuvius, the bay is so clogged with hot ash and pumice, which was falling on the ships as well, they simply could not reach the beach. They could not get close enough to shore to actually effect a rescue for these folks. So instead, they sail further south to the site of Stabii, where Pliny had another friend, Pomponianus, and he decides to spend the night there. Now, according to later accounts, this was a pretty disturbing night. Not only is there ash and rock falling from the sky, there are also near constant earthquakes. And the inhabitants of the villa flee the structure for fear that the roof will collapse on them. And sometime during the night, Pliny the Elder succumbed to what seems to have been some sort of asphyxiation, probably related to one of the pyroclastic surges from the course of the eruption. Now, at this time, Pliny was an older man. Pliny the Younger says he wasn't in the best of health, so he was probably already sort of respiratorily compromised and passed away as a result. Now, the second letter also says that even at Misenum to the north, Pliny the Younger and his mother, who had stayed behind, are also experiencing these near constant earthquakes. Now, they're not experiencing the same level of ash fall because, and we'll just quickly flip forward to the map. We can see here from the map that because of the direction of the winds that day, so south to south east, sorry, I had to check that for a second, much of the ash and pumice fall was directed to the southern part of the bay. So not a ton of it was falling on sites like Naples, ancient Neapolis, or Misenum. Nonetheless, they are experiencing these earthquakes. They too decide to flee the house at some point. And when they do, they see a roiling black cloud rolling across the bay towards them. They try to outrun it, but eventually they are sort of overcome by this choking cloud of ash. The good news is that by the time that choking cloud of ash crossed the bay, it had cooled sufficiently that no harm was done to them. But it was quite a disturbing encounter. So we get the date of the eruption, August 24th, 79 CE, from Pliny's account to Tacitus. But many scholars have questioned if that date is correct. And those of us who have studied medieval or even early modern manuscripts will be very well aware of the tendency for a text to accrue errors or variances as it is copied over and over and over the course of centuries. So you start with your original text, but everything's getting copied by hand in the days before the invention of the printing press. And the more you copy it, the more errors or changes can accrue, like a textual whisper down the lane. And so as a result of this, there are actually a number of different dates given in copies of Pliny's letters. And one of the most common is August 24th. But other dates, the dates sort of range from mid-August to late November, with most being concentrated sort of in October and November. And so it's long been a point of debate when the eruption actually took place. And the archaeology is actually quite contradictory because they've looked at the fruits that were preserved in the eruption, and some of the fruits seem appropriate to late summer, so August or maybe even early September, but others are more appropriate to later in autumn, like in October or November. So, it's unclear, did they just have an extended warm season, sort of what's going on with that. Other scholars have pointed to the fact that folks were wearing extremely heavy clothing when they perished in the eruption, using that as evidence that it took place later in the season. However, other scholars have rightly noted that if rocks are falling from the sky, raining down on you, you might put on your thickest cloak to try to protect yourself. So that evidence has been contradictory. But one discovery, the discovery of a small silver denarius in a coin cache in a house in Pompeii, suggests that maybe a later date is more appropriate. And I won't go into the full history, but suffice it to say that this is a coin of Titus. Titus became emperor in July or June. Let me consult my notes. June. He became emperor in June of 79 CE. And this coin records a number of his honors and awards, one of which we are fairly sure he did not receive until September of 79 CE. And if that's true, then Vesuvius could not have erupted in August, because not only would Titus have to receive the award, but then they would have to mint coins commemorating that award, and then distribute those coins for it to work its way into a coin hoard in Pompeii. But again, we don't have a definitive date of when he got that award. Well, to complicate things further, a recent discovery in Pompeii, so during these new excavations, seems to suggest a later date as well. So this is a graffito written in charcoal in an area of a private house that was undergoing restoration or some sort of construction work at the time of the eruption. And this graffito gives a date of October 17th. Now, it only gives the date, October 17th. It doesn't give us a year, but it's written in charcoal. And those of us who have ever worked with charcoal in any sort of capacity know that charcoal smudges. And if you're working with charcoal, you're going to get it all over your face and your clothes. And so, for this to give the date of October 17th and the eruption to take place in August 24th, it would mean that this charcoal graffito stayed on the wall for almost a year. That seems very unlikely. However, one of the most common dates found among these manuscripts for the eruption, in addition to August 24th, is October 24th. And it is much more likely that a charcoal graffito could last a week intact than it could last almost a year. And so many scholars, myself included, find this very compelling evidence that when we talk about Vesuvius, we should be talking about an eruption that took place October 24th, 79 CE. So, did the Romans know what was coming? Short answer, no, they did not. In general, it seems like the Romans did not recognize that Mount Vesuvius was an active volcano. Some seem not to have known that it was a volcano at all, while other Roman writers did speculate that maybe Vesuvius was an extinct volcano. And so here we see a fresco from Pompeii showing Mount Vesuvius in its pre-eruption state. I absolutely love this fresco because here we can see all of the vineyards covering the slopes of Vesuvius, and my very favorite version of the god Bacchus ever, Bacchus, the god of wine, here appearing in a fabulous grape suit, like the those terrible early 2000s Fruit of the Loom commercials with all the fruits and the guy in the grape suit. So they associated Vesuvius with fecundity and agriculture, and in particular with wine. Now, Pliny tells us that there were some weird occurrences happening around the Bay of Naples in the years leading up to, or not even in the years, in the months leading up to the eruption. So he reports, for example, that shepherds would find entire herds of sheep just dead in the pasture with no sort of evidence of injury or illness. They're just dead. And scholars speculate that this could be venting of gases that could have killed them. There's also some mention of ground deformation and changes to the coastline, also which are known precursors to the eruption. Pliny also says that earthquakes, there were a ton of earthquakes leading up to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. But he says that the residents of Campania were so accustomed to earthquakes that they didn't take it as anything out of the ordinary. Indeed, Campania was rocked by a very large earthquake on February 5th, 62 CE. And this earthquake was in fact centered quite close to Pompeii. And quite remarkably, there is a wonderful set of marble reliefs that actually document the large earthquake of 62 CE. These marble reliefs come from the base of a household altar, and they show us two views of Pompeii's Forum, showing us the Capitolium, the Temple of Jupiter, and the attached triumphal arch, all sorts of akimbo, right? Knocked akimbo here as the ground shakes. The fabulous sculptures of Castor and Pollux here, also akimbo. Here we also see a man preparing to make sacrifice at an altar. It's unclear if the earthquake interrupted a sacrifice or if sacrifices were made to ward off future earthquakes. In the other panel, we can see the back of the temple, and we can see where the entirety of the attached triumphal arch has broken apart. So this was enormously destructive. And indeed, even today, when you go and you look at the walls of buildings in Pompeii, you can make out the particular patterns of earthquake damage on the buildings and how they were rebuilt. So much of Pompeii was still undergoing construction 17 years later when the volcano erupted. And as a result, some scholars say, well, Pompeii never really recovered from the first earthquake. I disagree with that. I think it's much more likely based on what Pliny said about there being so many earthquakes that people were used to it. I think Pompeii and the whole region experienced a number of earthquakes leading up to the eruption, and that probably caused continuous damage to the city, that they're almost always playing sort of catch up with reconstruction. But regardless of the warning signs, there was no way for the Pompeians to know that Vesuvius would erupt on the morning of probably October 24th, 79 CE. The first, in the first phase, Vesuvius would have kind of hiccuped a little bit in the early morning hours. And it was probably this little hiccup, this small explosion, that Rectina was responding to when she wrote to Pliny the Elder for help. The big explosion, the first main explosion, came between 11 a.m. and noon, so right at midday. And that explosion would have been, I mean, quite remarkable for the entirety of the Bay of Naples. Certainly, everyone would have heard it and seen it, and it would have been quite terrifying, one thinks. The first communities to be affected by this would have been those immediately around Mount Vesuvius, so Herculaneum and Aplantis, while those sites further to the south wouldn't really start to experience any effects for a few hours. Within, say, 4 hours, pumice started to fall out of the sky onto Pompeii. And we're all probably familiar with pumice. You know, if you go to CVS and get the thing to scrub the skin off your feet, that's full of holes and scratchy, that is pumice. And it's porous because it's like superheated magma that's full of gas. And as it gets shot out of the volcano and it starts to cool, the gas escapes from it and leaves little holes in it. And so that's why pumice is porous. It's very light, it'll float in water. Only problem is meters and meters and meters and meters of it fell on the city of Pompeii in 2 different phases. The first phase was a white pumice fall that lasted about 7 hours. And then the second phase of gray pumice fall lasted for about 12 hours, depositing like 9 feet of pumice on the city of Pompeii. So a few pieces of pumice will float, and they're very light, 9 feet, not so light. At that point, you start to get roofs collapsing, and that's exactly what happened in Pompeii. So that many citizens of Pompeii actually left their homes and took to the streets because that was safer. In fact, most of the victims of the eruption are found on top of the pumice fall and not underneath of it. Some folks sought shelter in sort of outdoor areas. Other folks sought shelter in sturdy public buildings like the Quadriporticus, bigger buildings made out of sturdier materials that they felt more confident seeking shelter in. The real shame of this is that scholars estimate that to escape from Pompeii and get to safety, one would have to leave within, say, 4 hours of the initial big explosion. And indeed, when I was working there as an archaeologist, that was our safety plan. Should the volcano erupt, we would go back, we would get our passports and water and as much food as we could carry, and we would walk because it was a safer option than driving or trying to take the train. But we would have to do so immediately. But the Pompeians, they didn't have any reason to be scared for the first 4 hours. Nothing really happened in that time period. And so although many people fled the city eventually to try to get to safety, those folks would have been eventually caught and killed by the scariest part of any volcanic eruption, the pyroclastic surge. So this occurs when the eruption column, the big cloud over the mountain, gets too heavy for a variety of reasons. And once it gets too heavy, it collapses and it will roll down the sides of the mountain, achieving speeds of upwards of like 150 miles an hour. This is a giant cloud of superheated ash and gas, and it kills everything it touches. This is the deadly part of this kind of volcano. It will sweep across the landscape and it will kill everything in its path. Now, as we talked about with Mycenium, it does cool down sort of as it travels. And so eventually it will dissipate, but it can do an enormous amount of destruction in the meantime. Most Plinian eruptions don't just have one pyroclastic surge either. That cycle of explosion and collapse happens multiple times during the course of an eruption. And indeed with Vesuvius, it happened at least 7, perhaps 8 times before the eruption abated. And it was surge number 1 that killed the folks over in Herculaneum, but it was surge number 4 that killed people in Pompeii. Surge 3 actually made it all the way to Pompeii, but it had lost enough force, momentum, by the time it got there. It hit the northern city wall and stopped. But Surge 4 skated right over top of all of the debris left by Surge 3, right over the top of the city wall. It sheared off buildings at the 2nd story, and it killed anyone and anything left alive in Pompeii. Now, one of the most sort of iconic parts of Pompeii are the body casts. The technique for making the casts of the victims of Pompeii was developed in the 19th century. And essentially, so the victims, as I said, are largely found on top of the pumice, but they would have been covered over with a thick layer of ash and other volcanic debris. As the victims' soft tissues decayed, they kind of filtered down through the pumice. The ash itself hardened and sort of set up around them, creating a kind of mold, a mold that captured their final moments or the final disposition of their physical remains. And so after finding a number of these cavities in the ash, archaeologists began pouring plaster into them, and producing the famous body casts. Just quickly, get up on my soapbox real fast. I know we're running out of time, but this is kind of gross. And I don't mean gross as in, ew, bodies. I mean, these body casts, and for those of you who have visited Pompeii, you may have seen them. These are just kind of on display, kind of willy-nilly throughout the site. These are simply covered by like a plexiglass awning. This example is in it is a covered warehouse, but like the sides are open. I took this photograph through metal bars. And that seems rather disrespectful to me because these folks died in a horrible, horrible way, a way that is attested by the pose in which we find most of their bodies. Most of these victims are found in what's known as the pugilist pose, which is what happens when the muscles experience very high heat, the muscles contract, and the long muscles sort of pull up. So very often, the legs will sort of pull up towards the torso, and the arms and hands will pull up towards the face. And this is where you get pugilist pose, the boxer's pose. And many of the victims of Pompeii showed this, telling us that they were alive when they were engulfed by the pyroclastic surge. Some victims actually were not. Their bodies do not display the pugilist pose, suggesting that they had already passed by the time that they had gotten, that the pyroclastic surge hit. So we literally have the worst possible day of these folks' lives, and it's captured forever and displayed as a tourist attraction. Also, these casts are not well cared for. You can see that this victim, the plaster has come away from their skull, and their skull is totally exposed. So I don't blame anyone for being curious about this material. It's terribly interesting, but it's also terribly sad. I just wish that folks would approach these things with the proper reverence and the proper respect for the people who died here, because they were real people with friends and families and rivals, and they told dumb jokes, and they loved each other, and they got into fights, and they didn't want to go to work some days, right? They were so incredibly different from us, and yet they were people. And I think it's very important for us when we approach this material that we approach this as a human tragedy. Yes, it's such an important part of Roman archaeology and our knowledge about the ancient world, but it's also a very, very real human tragedy. And we're just about out of time, so you can see I have 41 slides here. But I want to quickly, I'm going to skip to the end. Let's do this way. I could talk about this all semester, and in fact, I recently did. So yeah, let's look here. So as I mentioned, the Great Pompeii Project has been ongoing over, I mean, really efforts have gone to help Pompeii have been going on for over a decade. Pompeii, especially in 2010, experienced a number of collapses due to general neglect of the buildings, but also to a particularly bad rainy season. So the Italian government tried to put some programs in place. They released a bunch of money, and I mean, in kind of expected form, the person they put in charge literally just embezzled all the money and did nothing. So in 2014, I believe, no, excuse me, in 2012, the European Union backed the Great Pompeii Project, a concerted effort to stabilize the existing architecture at Pompeii and do some much needed restoration. The project is estimated to be about $140 million. And in the most recent phases, they have begun digging in this area here, Regio 5, mostly because Region 9 And region 6 over here had a lot of collapses. So they've had to clear some of this out. And that's where they've made these amazing new discoveries. Like this poor dude who was killed in the eruption and then suffered the indignity of having a massive lintel block blown off a building to land on his head. This is not how he died. This happened post-mortem, but still the indignity. But they've also found fabulously beautiful new frescoes in houses, like this amazing fresco of gladiatorial combat, not unlike what one would see in Pompeii's amphitheater, or this beautiful first style painted imitation marble that we see in this photograph. Or my absolute favorite, this beautiful painted lararium or household shrine from a domestic garden. And this is, I love showing this to students because most of us probably are not familiar with fresco. Most of us have never tried it before, but fresco, when it is done correctly with good ingredients, is incredibly durable. And we can see these frescoes have been buried under volcanic ash for 2,000 years, and in many respects, they are as vibrant as they were the day they were painted. So it's really amazing to see Pompeii sort of yielding up even more of its secrets. And to be honest, if you had asked me 12 years ago, are they ever going to start digging again in Pompeii? Are they ever going to clear the areas that have never been cleared of the volcanic debris? I would have said absolutely not. They can't take care of what they have. They'll never expose the rest. Well, now in order to take care of what they have to expose the rest. So I will happily eat my words on that one. And that is it. Yes, thank you so much. I'm pleased to take any questions if anyone has some in the remaining few minutes.
So I have one. I don't believe it, but I've read that Romans didn't have a word for volcano until Vesuvius erupted. And doesn't this have to be false, since the Romans would have been in contact with Etna in Sicily?
Yes. Now, granted, I am not well familiar with, the etymology and all of that, but the Romans absolutely knew about volcanoes. In fact, I think it's Strabo who speculated that Vesuvius was an extinct volcano. So they're familiar enough with volcanoes to know that A, they exist, and B, that they have a sort of life cycle, that there are volcanoes that go quiet as well. So I think any suggestion that the Romans were ignorant of volcanoes is blatantly incorrect.
Okay, so that does explain for me why volcanic ash being a chief component of mortar and concrete, and the best being Campania from the Pozzolano.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I was wondering where they thought that ash came from, if not from a volcano. So
yeah, no, they were very aware of it.
Okay, very cool. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Any other questions?
The class is blocked off as a 2-hour if you wanted to keep going.
Oh, wait, it is? I thought I only had 1 hour.
No, it shows 2 hour on the schedule.
Oh, well, fantastic. Let's keep going. I only stopped because I thought I was running out of time. Actually, would anyone object to a very short intermission? We can refresh our drinks. I know I'm going to need some more water, so is that cool?
That's
Moderators?
Cool.
Sounds fine to me.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Well, let us take.
We didn't have that much of a long one, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I have slides. So
excellent.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that. It is interesting though, right? Because certainly here in Ansteorra, we are all now immediately familiar with natural disasters and the sort of complexity of dealing with them. And it's very interesting to think about, the Romans responding to a natural disaster of this size.
And in
And
this
they certainly,
region,
yeah,
because, you know, it's Italy's breadbasket, and, you know, the majority of the grain would have been coming from Egypt, but I'm sure it would have had a lot of effect on the population with the other food crops.
absolutely. So there's agricultural and in turn economic. I mean, this area, um, Campanian wines, I'm not sure that they have quite the reach, the export reach that their garum did, but certainly their garum production is now a problem. And that's a problem for the Roman aristocracy, because in addition to these luxury villas, these sort of vacation homes, many elite Romans also had agricultural villas in the area. So it would have had a direct economic impact on the people who make the decisions. So kind of no wonder that there is a response. Absolutely. And certainly there's a threat to the Roman fleet as well. This disaster would have, I mean, aside from the human toll, there's also a tremendous economic toll. And that is a lot more difficult for us to identify. A lot less is sort of made of that. I think there's some suggestion, I'm trying to think, I might have it in my notes on this PowerPoint, but I want to say that some have connected it to, I want to say maybe a plague that occurred in Rome shortly thereafter. And that's not entirely surprising, right? Because when you have famine, it weakens the population, and then you can get plague and things like that. But yeah, it would have had wide ranging, and not just in Italy either. I mean, ash from Vesuvius has been found as far away as East Asia, and there are significant ash deposits in Asia Minor. There's some suggestion that some of that ash may have made it all the way to North America as well. So there would have been long-term impacts on the climate that would have had serious ramifications for food supply and trade and things like that throughout the
So
empire.
they might have had like some sort of nuclear winter almost. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so Krakatoa, when Krakatoa erupted, Europe lost a summer, and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was much more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa. So it would have deposited far more ash into the atmosphere. There absolutely would have been a climate impact. And I want to say I read about a study at some point. No, I might be conflating that with another study. I thought I had read a study about them looking at like ice cores or like soil cores from around Europe to look at this, but I think I'm thinking of something else. So, but yeah, there would have been wide-ranging effects. Okay, thank you for the question.
thank you.
So yeah, so we've talked about Pompeii, and indeed, because Pompeii is a fairly large site, Pompeii tends to get the attention and certainly the tourism. But as I've mentioned, it's by no means the only site on the Bay of Naples affected by the eruption of Vesuvius. There are digs going on right now, ongoing digs at Torre Annunziata, which is, let me go to the slides, share my screen. Wait, no, oh, I wanted current slide. Sorry, student. I called you students, I apologize. I just got out of my last semester of classes.
We are students.
You are students, but just not the usual. Okay, so Aplantis is sort of, Aplantis is right here in that sort of immediate range as well. And so there are ongoing excavations at Aplantis here. There's a villa that seems to be an imperial villa that's going on. But proximity to Vesuvius absolutely affected affected what's sort of going on and the archaeology there. And so Herculaneum is probably the second best known site on the Bay of Naples, is another site that's really worth talking about, because what happened at Herculaneum is so very different from what happened at Pompeii. So here we're looking at the plan of Herculaneum, and I guess there's not a lot of scale here to compare it to our plan of Pompeii, but it's a very, very small excavated area compared to the excavations at Pompeii. At Pompeii, I mean, to really experience Pompeii, you kind of need 2 days. Here at Herculaneum, you can do all of Herculaneum justice in 4 hours. It's a rather small site. And we do think that Herculaneum itself was a smaller city than Pompeii. It's also been characterized as not so much a resort town, but more of a residential city without sort of the agricultural components or the trade or the industry and things like that. But part of the reason why so little of Herculaneum has been exposed is because it's under all of this. It's between 30 and 60 feet of volcanic material, all of the ash, all of the pumice, all of the stone that's raining down on raining down from Vesuvius, not just in the first explosion, but in all 8 explosions. So the material from the pyroclastic surge, right, didn't hit Pompeii until the 4th cycle of the eruption, the 4th explosion, the 4th surge. But every single one of those surges is dumping ash and stone on top of Herculaneum because of its close proximity to the volcano. And so it's a lot to get through. And moreover, because of its proximity to the coast, all of that ash is getting wet as it's setting up. And that wet ash hardens like concrete. And I feel comfortable saying that because I've dug through it with a shovel. And it is very, very difficult to excavate through. So it's both the quantity of material and the particular nature of the material. Because just to flip back quickly, these are the ancient boat houses of Herculaneum. So now Herculaneum's probably half a mile from the shoreline, but in antiquity, it was on the beach. So all of that water is essentially soaking that ash and setting it up like concrete. And in fact, going back to the pozzolana being the key ingredient in Roman concrete, especially the ingredient that makes it harden in salt water, well, that same ash, that same material is now coming into contact with salt water and forming essentially concrete on top of Herculaneum. So excavation efforts there have been pretty much curtailed. Also now you can see there is a modern city, Ercolano, which sits on top of much of the city. So this is probably about as much Herculaneum as we are going to get. So because of the close proximity of Herculaneum to Vesuvius, when that first pyroclastic surge and all of the other pyroclastic surges swoops down the sides of the mountains, it doesn't have a lot of time to cool off. So the surge that hit Herculaneum was much, much hotter than the surge that hit Pompeii. In Pompeii, it was hot enough to kill instantly. But at Herculaneum, it didn't just kill instantly, it actually carbonized some of the, well, we'll say some of the organic matter there. So here we're looking at two examples of the kinds of carbonized organic material found at Herculaneum. The very famous carbonized loaf of Roman bread that is the inspiration for all of us who have endeavored to do any sort of Roman cooking and to get the distinctive sort of shape by wrapping our twine around it and stamping it. This is how we have that information, also from paintings. And then I really love this. These are carbonized sliding wooden screens from the House of the Wooden Partitions. And these are sliding doors, essentially, that would have separated the public side of the Roman house, the atrium, the large central room, the first room you enter when you enter a Roman house. That was considered a more or less public space, the space where the head of the household would receive his clients in the morning, first thing in the morning for the salutatio, and where, you know, clients could kind of wander in during the day. The parts of the house behind the atrium sort of get increasingly private, by which I mean access to those spaces gets increasingly restricted. A client of the sort of man of the house would certainly need permission to enter that part of the house. And in fact, most of the guests entertained in sort of the back of the house would have been people of equal or even higher social standing than the homeowner himself. So certainly when we look at Roman houses, we have an expectation that there are things like this, that there's wooden furniture, there are textiles, wall hangings, rugs, things like that. Things that could be used to sort of divide and define the spaces of the house. But in so many cases, those have disappeared, but not here at Herculaneum. And unfortunately, those same superheated clouds, pyroclastic surges, which carbonized organic material, also ended the lives of many of the residents of Herculaneum. Now, when archaeologists first started excavating Herculaneum, they're going through the town and they are finding physical remains occasionally of victims, but not nearly in the numbers that they saw in Pompeii. And especially with Herculaneum's close proximity to the sea, archaeologists were quite optimistic at first that many of the residents of Herculaneum may have been able to escape. That is, until they began excavating the boat houses. These, again, are boat houses. This would have been ancient beach. And when they began excavating the boat houses, they found the physical remains of more than, I believe, 300 people who had been sheltering in the boat houses, clearly waiting for rescue from the sea. And indeed, there were a number of victims actually found on the beach, usually men who were armed, suggesting that they were maybe guards or lookouts or something. But unfortunately, there was nothing that could have saved the residents of Herculaneum from their ultimate fate. Now, and again, sorry, I probably should have warned people that there were going to be more physical remains. Feel free to turn away if you're uncomfortable with that and you're still with us. But I hope y'all know that I'm not showing these pictures to be macabre in any sort of way. But again, I, as an archaeologist, as a scholar, and as a human being, I have tremendous compassion for these folks. I think they should be treated with respect, and we should both appreciate the horrible thing that they went through, and learn about it. If they had to die, in the very least, we can maybe learn something from it. But this is not a macabre look at the gross body sort of thing. And fortunately, at Herculaneum, they don't treat it as a macabre gross body sort of thing, because you'll notice that the boathouses with physical remains of victims are covered. So they have fabric coverings, and then they're also gated. So these are not available for tourists to sort of gawk at. But the physical remains of the victims that were found in the boathouses also show evidence of the tremendous heat that carbonized so much of the material here. They were killed instantly and left laying there. We find physical remains of folks from all social strata. It seems to be from everyone from enslaved people to very, very wealthy people who are all sort of mixed up in these spaces. But because that all of the volcanic material that fell on them, as we said, it mixed with the water and it became quite hard, it also became quite heavy. So that as the soft tissues of the victims decayed, the ash just sort of continued to compress on top of them. So we don't get the sort of body molds that we see at Pompeii. Rather, the victims were sort of just compressed under all of this material. So we don't have impressions of their clothing, but certainly we can excavate the possessions that they had on them. Many physical remains were found with, as much portable wealth as they could carry. So jewelry, sacks of coins, things like that. This woman still has her finger rings on. We can still see her bracelets. We can even make out the tiny bones of the fetus that she was carrying because she was in fact pregnant at the time of her death. Again, real people going through the worst experience that they've ever gone through. And trying to reconcile that. I will say that it's not just all sadness. There was a very cool recent discovery. I guess anthropologists were examining the physical remains of a victim who was found in a temple. So not here at the boathouses, but in another part of the city. And they're having a look at his skeleton, and suddenly they notice this black glassy material that's sort of filling, or that there are shards of inside the skull and inside his vertebrae. And so they take samples and they look at it, and it's his brain and spinal cells. The surge was so hot that it vitrified his organs. It turned them essentially into glass, which is both horrifying and an incredible discovery for archaeologists and anthropologists to now be able to look at this material. So horrific, but also leads to really interesting discoveries. So what happens in the aftermath? Well, as we were sort of talking about during the intermission, the city of Rome itself, not even just Rome as empire, but Rome, the capital, had huge investments in the Bay of Naples. It was a huge center of agricultural production. Many very wealthy Romans, including members of the imperial family, had both sort of vacation villas and working villas or working farms here. And of course, there is the sheer magnitude of human devastation. So Titus, who had only just become emperor in June of that year, quickly organizes a relief effort. So he dispatches special officials to go down to the Bay of Naples and to sort of oversee recovery efforts. He offers incentives, some of which were funded by his personal treasury, to cities like Capua and Naples, who were less affected, to resettle refugees. And even today, there is a neighborhood in Naples known as the Herculaneum quarter for the refugees from Herculaneum who were resettled there. So we do know that some people were able to escape because they had to be resettled. They survived the eruption. They probably left as soon as the first explosion happened, and they were able to get far enough to be saved. We also know that there were recovery efforts at least in the city of Pompeii and probably all over the place. So when archaeologists began excavating Pompeii, and in particular the Forum, what they found were no statues. And we know, both from depictions of Pompeii's Forum and from the many statue bases that were found in situ, that there were tons of statues in both marble and bronze that filled Pompeii's Forum, and they were gone by the time archaeologists got there. Because removing sculptures, and the fact that they removed all of them, because that would take a lot of organization, we do think that that was something that was done deliberately and probably shortly after the eruption, like a deliberate recovery effort versus later looting or things like that. There are also weird tunnels that were cut through the walls of houses here. Some of these tunnels even have like coins and other datable artifacts that, you know, fell out of someone's pocket that show that people from immediately after the eruption to the medieval period were tunneling under the ground and tunneling into Pompeii. Now, immediately after the eruption, this is probably an attempt to recover personal property, whether it was your property or you're trying to take someone else's. But as time went on, this was almost certainly looting, right? Looking for valuable materials and things like that. And I'm not sure if this is anachronistic, I don't think it is, but if I recall correctly, they've also found physical remains in some of these tunnels of people who like maybe broke through a wall and hit a pocket of trapped volcanic gas, and died as a result. That might be anachronistic, but I don't think it is. So there are, on the one hand, there is an official response, an attempt to recover property, and an official response that incentivizes resettling of victims. And then there is the sort of afterlife where people are just coming in and looting. And this would have looked like a moonscape for years, decades afterwards. And by the time folks do start resettling in this area, local knowledge probably would have remembered sort of the location of these towns, but especially at Pompeii, where the second stories of the buildings were sheared off, eventually the ground level was going to rise enough to disguise any remains that would have been visible. And the location was lost, beginning in sort of the late medieval, early modern period. Now, your friend and mine, Domenico Fontana, actually accidentally found Pompeii, but didn't know what he had found. So he was digging a canal. He had this big engineering project. So he's digging a canal, and he actually dug the canal straight through Pompeii. And as they were digging, they were uncovering bits of archaeology, but they didn't know what they had located. And so Pompeii remains kind of protected, at least for a little while longer. In Herculaneum, in the 18th century, a man, 18th century? No, 16th century, 17th century, excuse me. A man in Herculaneum was digging a well in his basement, and he started pulling up marbles, big ones, intact, life-size marble sculptures, like the large and small Herculanean woman who we see here. And this attracted the attention of the Bourbon kings of Naples. And the current king was like, I am currently building myself a very, very nice villa. And you know what would go great in my villa? A bunch of ancient Roman sculpture. Thus begin the first attempts at excavating Herculaneum. As I said, excavating Herculaneum was incredibly difficult because of the depth and the nature of the material. And so there was no systematic excavation in the sense of the sort of top-down, remove layer by layer by layer kind of archaeology, stratigraphic archaeology that we do today. Instead, they started digging series of tunnels, very quickly realizing that they were on top of Herculaneum's theater. And these tunnels revealed a wealth of sculptural decoration that would have adorned the theater at the time. And truly, for much of archaeology's history, this is not an attempt to learn about the past or uncover ancient architecture. This is a straight up treasure hunt. The stated goal was to recover marbles that would then adorn the king's villa. That was the goal. And the marbles that they found a wealth of marble sculpture from the villa, including this marble equestrian sculpture of Marcus Nonius Balbus. Marcus Nonius Balbus was a leading citizen of Herculaneum. He had contributed greatly to the city. And in fact, he was honored with multiple public statues throughout the city, not just in the theater, but also here on this sort of terrace level close to the sea. So Marcus Nonius Balbus is kind of a well-known character from Herculaneum. Additionally, excavations would reveal the Villa of the Papyri, a suburban villa, that is, a villa located just outside the city's walls. Here, located quite close to the coast. And the Villa of the Papyri is so named for the contents of the library at the villa, which were discovered as just a mass of carbonized scrolls. And they're naturally quite fragile. And there have been a wide variety of kind of attempts to figure out what's in them, because from the ones that we have been able to sort of identify and look at, there are absolutely texts contained in that library that do not survive anywhere else, even texts that we had never heard of. Unfortunately, most of the time when you try to unroll them, you just end up ruining them. But there are a number of projects ongoing to try to sort of read them without unrolling them. I believe there's one project that's like using MRI technology because of the metallic-based ink that the scrolls are written on. They can do a sort of scan and then take that information and sort of digitally unroll it. So there's a lot of exciting work being done there that is very, very promising. But the Villa of the Papyri also had an incredible collection of sculpture, many of which are made of bronze. And this is what's really remarkable. Bronze does not survive well from antiquity, and that's because it has a tendency to be melted down for other things later on. Most of our ancient bronzes, the ones that do survive because of some accident. So like the Delphi charioteer, an early classical sculpture, votive sculpture from the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, that was buried under a landslide, which protected it. The Riace warriors were found in a shipwreck. They were being shipped from Greece to Italy, and the ship wrecked off the coast of Italy, preserving them. And here, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius protected these bronzes, which are very eclectic. They include a bronze portrait of a Hellenistic ruler, a resting Hermes, and this collection of dancing maidens. What's very interesting, so we know wealthy Romans regularly collected Greek art, either art that was made in Greece and shipped to Rome for the art market, or art made in Rome that emulates Greek compositions, famous Greek sculptures, or even just Greek styles. But because these sculptural collections almost never survive intact, scholars haven't really been able to sort of study the habits of a single art collector. But the collection of this villa allows us to do so. And all of these little squares that you see in the courtyard, those are all statue bases. So it shows you how they were arranged in this open courtyard. What's very interesting is that there seems to be very little rhyme or reason to this collection. Scholars have always wondered, you know, do you choose a theme or a particular style or a material? No, there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to this collection, at least none that we can discern based on our own knowledge. But this is a very, very important collection of sculpture. Also, this villa seems to have been originally built by Julius Caesar's father-in-law, although we do not know who owned it at the time of the eruption. So that's kind of disappointing. So there are, I don't know why I have these stars here. So going back to Pompeii, we have other stuff to look at. There are some suburban villas outside of Pompeii. The so-called Villa of Cicero and the Villa of Diomedes. This is the road that leads north to Herculaneum. Down to the south is the road that leads to Stabii, and indeed the project that I worked on excavated the area just inside and just outside the Porta Stabia. So in what comes to be known as the sort of entertainment district here. Oh, coming back to Pompeii and its discovery. So Pompeii similarly becomes discovered, or is rediscovered, I should say, in the late 18th century. And the priorities at this time were very much the same. It was, let's find pretty things. Let us find the artworks that will go and will adorn the king's villa, the Bourbon king's villa. And so practices included cutting frescoes out of the wall, separating them from their original context, and shipping them off. Because the artistic interests at the time, they were not interested in the wall as a whole. They were interested in figural mythological paintings. And so they just cut them out of the walls. So here, fortunately, in some cases, we are able to at least know that this scene of Ariadne and Theseus from the House of the Boar Hunt comes from this wall. But other frescoes in the collection, so the Bourbon Kings of Naples collection eventually formed the core of what is now the Naples Museum. So much of this material is in the Naples Museum. And some of the paintings we simply can't associate with their original context. So not only is the wall ruined, but that original context is lost forever. So excavations continued, and with new printing technologies, interest grows and grows across Europe. And remember that this is sort of corresponding with the Enlightenment, where there is a profound intellectual, philosophical, historical, political, and of course artistic interest in ancient Greece and Rome. This is also the time of the Grand Tour, where serious artists and intellectuals, serious young men, would travel across Europe to sites that were important to their education, including many sites in Greece and Rome, or Greece and Italy, I should say. And so with the advent of sort of printing technology, they could kind of take home souvenirs, and knowledge of and interest in Pompeii just explodes in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. In fact, Pompeii will become an inspiration for all other sorts of creative endeavors, including this painting, The Last Days of Pompeii, a sort of fantastically apocalyptic depiction of the end of Pompeii's life. And in fact, the fate of Pompeii is often seen or is often depicted at this time as a kind of moralizing tale, that Pompeii had lost its way, that Pompeii was overrun by greedy, ladder climbing freedmen and prostitutes, and that they were punished for their excess. Because, I mean, frankly, you know, in the neoclassical period, so in the late 18th and early 20th century, all of these very serious men looked up to the Romans, right? They are pillars of morality and, you know, respectability and gravity and dutifulness. They are serious, right? In the way that these men fancied themselves to be serious. And then they start digging in Pompeii, and they find erect phalluses everywhere, in the form of terracotta tiles, in the form of amulets, wind chimes, oil lamps, everywhere, phalluses everywhere. And they were horrified, absolutely horrified at this. And then as they excavate more, they started to find images of sexual activity. So wall paintings showing very, very frank, shall we say, sexual encounters between both opposite sex and same-sex couples in houses, in the changing rooms of the bath, in taverns. And suddenly the excavators are having to deal with the fact that these people, who they think are very sort of morally upstanding and very serious, were okay with images of very frank images of sexual intercourse and homosexual encounters, and there are phalluses everywhere, and they're like, oh God, what happened to their morality? This doesn't match with our idea of Roman morality. And so the Pompeians must have been really immoral. Well, never mind the fact that in ancient Rome, the erect phallus was absolutely a sign of protection, good luck, and abundance. And it does show up everywhere because it was not necessarily given the same sort of sexualized stigma that certainly 18th and 19th century society put on it, or even that our own society kind of puts on it. Likewise, those images of sexual encounters, they had their own meanings within the broader context of Roman society. They were not pornography in the sense that there's no reason to think they were put there to give the viewer sexual stimulation. They function in an entirely different way. But because the modern people looking back at it were so invested in their own idea of who the Romans were and what Roman culture was, they decided that Pompeii had just gone to hell in a handbasket and they were punished by the gods. And so many of these 19th century depictions of Pompeii are quite apocalyptic and demoralizing in this sense. But these new discoveries also triggered an incredible craze for all things Roman all across Europe. Um, Certainly the very wealthy, the aristocrats of Europe, started pretty much having toga parties, dressing in Roman styles, even building their homes in a style that emulated that found at Pompeii. And this is a painting that shows a room in the house of Prince Jerome Napoleon, who did up his house like a Roman house. And so this room would correspond to the atrium of a Roman house, with the opening in the ceiling that would allow water to fall in the shallow impluvium, the shallow pool below. Yeah, it's really wild. This house no longer exists, unfortunately, because I would love to go and hang out there. Even those who perhaps weren't wealthy enough to build a Roman house could also kind of go wild for Pompeii. Scenes like this scene of an old woman selling cupids. This is from the Villa Ariana at Stabii, and this inspired a bunch of different things in the 18th century, including Wedgwood scenes and even wallpaper designs. So people really go wild for this stuff. But by the end of the 19th century, and certainly by the early 20th century, first and foremost, Pompeii and the Bay of Naples are starting to get a little bit overshadowed by the discovery of, for example, the palace at Knossos, Troy, Mycenae, the discovery of Tut's tomb. And so less and less attention starts to be paid there. But just quickly, this is Giuseppe Fiorelli. He's the guy responsible for inventing the plaster cast motif, and also for dividing the city up into different regions. And so within each region, the doorways are numbered as well. So Pompeii does have its own kind of address system. In the early part of the 20th century, obviously Europe is going through some stuff between World War I and World War II, but quite a lot of work is actually done in the Bay of Naples under Mussolini, because Mussolini styled his fascist party, and certainly himself, as the ones who would give birth to a new Rome, right? Who would restore Italy to the greatness of the Roman Empire. And Mussolini absolutely had plans to be buried in the mausoleum of Augustus. In fact, if you visit the mausoleum of Augustus in Rome, which has just reopened, the whole square around it is just ringed with these really, really ugly fascist buildings, because Mussolini intended to be buried there. So he invests quite a lot in doing additional excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum because of his general interest in ancient Rome as a legitimizing force for what he wants to do. Pompeii did not fare well during World War II. In fact, the Allies bombed Pompeii in September of 1943 based on bad information that the Germans were storing munitions at the site. And I have personally, there's still shrapnel from that bombing embedded in some of these houses, and I've personally seen it. So that was enormously destructive. And then through the 20th century, there were a few additional excavations, but already there were problems. And tourism is great. The interest of the public is great, but tourism is very, very hard on archaeological sites. And if they are not properly cared for, you can expect a lot of damage. And it was really sort of decades of neglect, as well as these weather conditions that led up to all of the collapses that happened in the second decade of the 21st century. But it's getting better. Germany stepped in and said, Italy, you have to follow a schedule. because if you don't, you're not getting more money. And Germany set up the rules for the Great Pompeii project, and it kind of helped. So that is actually it for the presentation. Our whirlwind tour through Pompeii and the Bay of Naples. So in the remaining time again, have we generated any new questions from this material?
I hate to go back so far, but there were a couple of images that you used toward the beginning of your presentation that I'd like to know sources for. There was an image, I think, from the naval base looking across the Bay of Naples with Vesuvius in the background. And it did not look contemporary to me, but I'm not sure. So
let me pull this up. Is this what? Is this the image that you were referring to?
Hang on a second. I'm not.
You are not sharing at the moment, but you are.
I'm not sharing my screen. Let me share my screen.
The image I can't see may well be the image I'm referring to.
Indeed, it may well be.
This is one of the ones I was interested in, and that looks like a modern projection.
Yes, this is just a modern projection, and it's actually wrong. It's wrong. It's a nice effect, but the layout of the city is wrong.
Ah, interesting.
The amphitheater should be down here. It's what
I should confess, part of my interest here is that I really would like to create a fresco with the full aisle with the arched doorway looking out over the Bay of Naples and seeing about Vesuvius in the background. I think would be a magnificent piece of art to have.
Amazing. I will be, I am very happy. Off the top of my head, I don't have the image references for this, but I'm very happy to share this entire presentation with you, this whole PowerPoint, if that would be helpful.
I think it might be, and I might have some specific questions. I think if you go back one or two more pages, you'll see there was an image there that caught my eye. That one was interesting because of being a contemporary.
Yes.
Being a contemporary image showing the grape arbors on the side of Vesuvius. And
indeed, and the shape of Vesuvius, because this is Vesuvius now. So Vesuvius, it's kind of growing its little cone, but the explosion was a little off center. So we have a much different profile here to the volcano than we did then. But I will go back.
Okay.
Is it this? I think that's the same one, the incorrect one.
Yeah, just a little bit. This one.
Okay, so this is Thomas Burke, the Younger Pliny reproved, from 1749 to 1815.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. It was probably much more modern. But I like that image of the scene as seen through the archway.
And what 17-year-old boy is like, no, I'm more interested in writing than looking at this giant explosion.
I'm gonna stay home and do my homework.
I'm gonna stay home and do my homework, which was maybe just a cop-out. Maybe he was scared, and rightfully so, because I don't know, if I saw an unfamiliar cloud rising over a mountain, I would be scared. So
look, that mountain's blowing up. Let's go take a closer look.
Yeah, let's just sail down there. It'll be fine. It is not fun. So so yeah, but that's a good one. That always reminds me it always connects for me to Angelica Kaufman's Cornelia displaying her children or pointing to her children as her treasures. There's something about Burke's conception of Pliny's mom here that reminds me very much of Kaufman's Cornelia. Same sort of thing, same neoclassical nonsense.
I have to wonder how much the contemporary archaeology of the time affected early Texas sort of fascination with Rome, and the Roman influence on early Texas architecture, both in the columns and domes of our capital, and just the architectural style of some of those early buildings. I'm thinking of some arched colonnades we have at a local building here that was built probably around 1900, but it's like there's a Roman influence on the architecture here, partly due to similarity of climate, but I think partly deliberately adapting. Oh, it's hot here. Maybe we should do the things the Romans did because they lived in a hotter climate too, as opposed to all these folks who just come here from north of England by way of Tennessee. Like maybe we should do something a little different here than we did back home.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so there are sort of dual influences there, right? I mean, certainly the Spanish influence and the Iberian Peninsula has had so many cultures sort of come through, but Spain was also one of Rome's earliest colonies or earliest provinces. And so there's a tremendous sort of cultural, architectural connection between Spain and Italy that certainly has been conditioned by other cultures over time. And then, you know, it sort of comes to the New World that way. But there is absolutely, I mean, going back truly to the foundation of the United States, there is a very effort to emulate Rome. And that is expressed. I mean, that's why when we see neoclassical architecture, not just in Texas, but throughout the United States, it's Capitol buildings, courthouses, these public buildings related to governance that were held up. And what's very interesting, though, I think it's very interesting, is that the founding fathers, like, we don't have really well-trained architects and artists in the United States at the time of the Revolution, and many of those we did said, screw it, I'm going back to England. And so in addition to all of our sort of political alliances with the French, a lot of the art of the early United States is designed by French artists who, again, they're coming out of the French Revolution. They have a very similar related interest in Rome as a model. And so they're already sort of developing this neoclassical architectural and artistic vocabulary, which we then just hire them to do for us. And it very much sticks. And then we see a revival, yet another sort of revival, in the late 19th and early 20th century. So yeah, it's very much a very deliberate emulation of that because of the values that we attach to ancient Rome.
Yeah. Well, we're in the process of planning a house on 10 acres that we're developing just outside of Cockress Cove. And when we get that done, we'll have to have you come and pay a visit and sit in the shade of the colonnade around our courtyard. And
I will. I would love to. And we can go for a stroll. We'll go for our ambulatio after lunch because it helps digestion. I would love that. That would be wonderful. And this is a blanket invitation to everyone who attended. I love nothing more than talking about Rome. And my joke is that I keep trying to make Rome happen in Ansteorra. And some folks are, you know, super receptive, and some folks have other areas of interest, which is totally legit. But anyone who wants to talk about any facet of ancient Rome, please let me know. I love nothing more than talking about it.
Well,
We'd
we
love
need to
to have you
talk
in our
about
shield.
fabrics.
Yes, we do.
I have the book. I'm ready to sew, or not sew, or sort of sew. And I
Okay.
saw that Tadia lit up, and I talked over her. So please, Tadia, please say what you were going to say.
Oh no, just that we would love to have you give a talk for North Shield. We're in the process of establishing a weekus. So yeah, so
Awesome.
we're really interested in having people talk from all over the SCA in it.
Absolutely. Please let me know. I have currently